The Manhattan sky darkened without warning, swallowing the late afternoon light in rolling sheets of gray. The towers of glass and steel reflected the storm's arrival like 1,000 shifting mirrors. James Blackwood, 33 years old, and the master of an empire he had built from nothing, stepped out of the revolving doors of his corporate headquarters. He adjusted the cuffs of his custom-tailored suit and checked his Rolex 230. Exactly 2 weeks until his wedding to Victoria pierced the union of his billion-dollar tech dynasty and her family's old-world fortune. Everything in his life was carefully timed, plotted, and executed. Nothing was left to chance, not in his business, not in his personal life, not in his carefully curated future. The first heavy drops of rain splattered against the sidewalk, darkening the pale stone. James raised his gaze, frowning at the storm clouds barreling across the skyline. Manhattanners rushed for shelter, darting beneath awnings, newspapers held over heads, umbrellas snapping open in a forest of black nylon. James prided himself on never being caught off guard, on controlling every detail. Yet here he was, suit, jacket beating with water, reaching for a cab like any other man. James Blackwood never gets caught in the rain, he muttered to himself with a dry smile as a yellow taxi slowed at the curb. He reached for the door handle, already anticipating the warm leather interior, the escape from the downpour, and that was when he saw her, across the wide street, weaving through the storm's chaos. A woman hurried forward, one hand shielding her face, the other guiding 3 small children. They were bundled in bright raincoats, red, blue, and yellow, like a splash of color against the gray wash of the storm. Their tiny boots splashed through puddles as she urged them along, her movements graceful but protective. James's eyes narrowed, some forgotten instinct pulling his focus past the umbrellas and rain. She turned her head to glance back at the children, and in that fraction of a moment, James's heart froze. Sarah Mitchell, the name rang in his chest like an old bell, sharp and undeniable. Sarah, the woman he had loved in his hungry, uncertain 20s. Sarah, who had believed in him when his company was nothing but sketches on a napkin. Sarah, whose face, tearful, devastated, had haunted his dreams long after he had silenced those memories for the sake of ambition. The one he had left behind in Brooklyn with nothing more than a rushed phone call, and promises he never kept. Rain blurred his vision, but nothing could obscure her. She hadn't noticed him yet, her face, pale against the storm, her arms gathering the little girls closer. And then it hit him, not just her presence, but there's the children. 3 small girls with golden hair slipping out from under their hoods, identical, impossibly so. James felt the air leave his lungs as he watched them shuffle along, each a mirror of the other, as if sensing the intensity of his stare. Sarah lifted her eyes across the crowded street. Their gazes met, piercing through sheets of rain and the blur of umbrellas. She froze, the color drained from her face, her lips parting slightly, recognition shattering her composure. At that same instant, one of the little girl's yellow raincoat, wide-eyed and curious, followed her mother's sightline. Her gaze landed on James. She tugged at her mother's sleeve, then pointed a small hand across the street, her voice rising with innocent clarity. "That's the man in Mommy's special box," she announced. "The one that makes her cry at night." The words carried impossibly clear through the storm, slicing into James like a blade. The city's noise fell away, the honking cabs, the slapping footsteps, the crack of thunder. Everything receded until there was only the child's voice echoing in his ears. James staggered back a step, his hand still clutching the taxi door, water running down his face in rivulets. He stared at the little girl, really seeing her now, the curve of her chin, the delicate shape of her nose, the startling familiarity of her eyes. His eyes. He looked to the other 2 and saw it again. Unmistakable, undeniable, not just Sarah's children. His. The revelation struck with physical force, buckling the careful scaffolding of certainty he had built around himself. 5 years of power, of headlines and acquisitions, of dinners in penthouses and whispered praise from boardrooms suddenly hollow. His perfect wedding with Victoria, reduced to a fragile stage set ready to collapse at the slightest touch. The taxi driver leaned over, shouting through the rain, "You getting in or what, mister?" James couldn't move. Across the street, Sarah's face was a storm of its own fear, anger, and something he couldn't yet name. She gathered the girls close, her movements sharp, protective, hurried, and then she turned, steering them around the corner, vanishing from sight. The taxi drove off with an impatient roar, leaving James standing alone in the rain, drenched to the bone, his world tilted on its axis. In that fleeting moment, with a child's innocent declaration, James Blackwood discovered the truth. He had daughters, 3 of them, and he had already missed nearly 5 years of their lives. The rain had followed James all the way back to his penthouse. Though the sky above Manhattan had already cleared, it clung to him in the way the city lights reflected against the wet glass of the towers, in the way the marble floors of his apartment gleamed with the water still dripping from his clothes. The doorman had greeted him, concern etched in his voice, but James hadn't answered. He moved like a man in a trance, his mind echoing with words that refused to release him. "That's the man in Mommy's special box that makes her cry at night." He tore off his soaked jacket and tossed it aside, leaving a dark imprint on the pristine couch. His gaze drifted to the framed photographs on the wall. His engagement shoot with Victoria, the society heiress with flawless smile and flawless pedigree. 2 weeks from now, their wedding would tie his empire to hers. 2 weeks from now, the world would celebrate him not only as a billionaire visionary, but as the husband of one of America's most influential women. 2 weeks from now, and none of it mattered anymore. He could still see them, 3 small figures in raincoats, clustered under Sarah's protective arm. The red, the blue, the yellow. He hadn't been able to stop staring at their faces. His faces, every instinct screamed the truth, though logic tried to fight it. Coincidence, imagination, projection, but he knew. He had always known something about Sarah had been left unfinished. He poured himself a drink, whiskey sloshing into crystal with unsteady hands, then abandoned it untouched. Instead, he sat at his massive oak desk, fingers trembling against the keyboard as he typed, "Sarah Mitchell Interior Design." The search results appeared instantly. Mitchell Design, breathing new life into historical properties. There she was, Sarah, on the homepage, standing confidently beside a restored Victorian staircase, her hair swept back, her expression calm and professional. A woman who had rebuilt her life without him. A woman who had raised children, his children alone. James leaned back, the weight of 5 years crashing over him. He remembered the last time he'd heard her voice. He had been pacing outside an investor's office in Silicon Valley, his phone pressed to his ear, adrenaline pumping through his veins. "They're offering funding, Sarah. This is it. The chance we've been waiting for." Her silence had stretched across the line, heavy and loaded. Finally, she'd asked, "What about us, James?" "This is our plan," he'd said, blind with ambition. "You can join me later. I have to take this shot. James, please. There's something I need to tell you." But he had cut her off, hanging up with the arrogance of a man who believed the world would wait. He hadn't listened. He hadn't cared. And now he understood what she had been trying to tell him. His phone buzzed on the desk. Victoria's name flashed across the screen. He answered, his voice hollow. "Darling, have you seen the write-up? In Vogue, they're calling it the wedding of the decade. Daddy says no expense is too great. Did you approve the roses, Victoria?" His voice trailed off as he stared at Sarah's photo on the computer screen. Her eyes no longer soft with love, but sharp with independence. "You sound strange. Is something wrong?" she pressed. "I need to handle something," James said. His tone was distant, final. He ended the call before she could protest. The silence of his penthouse pressed down on him like a weight. For the first time, the glass walls, the imported art, the luxury furnishings, all of it felt like a cage, a prison built from choices he thought were victories. 3 little girls had walked through the rain today and destroyed his empire of certainty. With a single sentence, he called his assistant, "Matthews, cancel everything for the week, sir. The Tokyo team is..." "I said everything," when the call ended. James sat in the dark, his city glittering below him, and whispered to himself words he'd never said before. "I'd have daughters." By morning, he'd hired a private investigator. He didn't ask himself if it was right or wrong, if Sarah would hate him more for digging into her life. He only knew he couldn't breathe without answers. 3 days later, a manila envelope lay on his desk. Photographs spilled across the mahogany like shards of another life. Sarah entering a brownstone in Brooklyn. Sarah at a cafe, reviewing blueprints. Sarah at a school gate, holding the hands of 3 identical girls. Emma, Olivia, Abigail. For years, 7 months old. No father listed on their birth certificates. Born premature. Surviving weeks in the NICU while Sarah recovered from emergency. Surgery, James's vision blurred as he read. He could picture it. Sarah alone, terrified, clutching 3 impossibly small lives against impossible odds. While he had been toasting champagne at his first acquisition deal, his gaze landed on one photograph. The triplets and sundresses, laughing on a park bench, each wore a different color: red, blue, yellow. Emma smiling wide, Olivia staring at something off frame, Abigail gazing into the lens with unnerving seriousness. He whispered their names, testing them, claiming them. Emma, Olivia, Abigail. His phone rang again, Victoria's ringtone. He let it buzz until it died. For the first time in his life, James Blackwood had no idea how to move forward. He only knew one thing with absolute certainty: his wedding was a lie. His empire was meaningless. And somewhere in Brooklyn lived 3 little girls who called another man a stranger, and called him the one in Mommy's box, and he was going to change that. The brownstone across from the little cafe had become the center of James Blackwood's world. For 3 mornings in a row, he had sat tucked away in a corner booth with a newspaper he never read, and coffee that turned cold before he touched it. From behind dark glasses and the shield of his baseball cap, the billionaire CEO, who usually lived under flashing camera lights and magazine covers, watched the quiet domestic ritual unfold with mechanical precision. At exactly 7:45 a.m., Sarah emerged from the weathered wooden door, one hand balancing a tote bag crammed with papers, the other ushering 3 little girls in color-coded raincoats down the steps. Emma in red darted forward with reckless energy, always the first to reach the gate. Olivia in blue followed in neat, deliberate steps, clutching her matching lunchbox as if she'd packed it herself. Abigail in yellow lingered close to Sarah's side, head tilted upward, eyes scanning the world with a kind of quiet, unsettling awareness. James couldn't breathe as he watched them. Each morning felt like punishment and salvation at once. He had missed for years, 7 months, and countless mornings like this. He had no right to insert himself now. And yet he could not look away. By afternoon, he followed them to the playground. He kept to the edge, sitting on a park bench, sunglasses in place, a ball cap pulled low. From there, he learned more about his daughters than any report could have told him. Emma climbed the tallest slide without hesitation, shouting for Sarah to watch as she threw herself down. With wild laughter, Olivia bent over the sandbox, carving neat walls and towers with careful hands, her focus absolute. Abigail sat on a swing, moving slowly, watching the trees, the pigeons, even him, especially him. More than once, James swore her solemn eyes caught his through the distance. Though she said nothing, it wasn't enough. Watching from the edges was killing him. He needed to cross the invisible line, to step inside the world Sarah had built without him. But how? Sarah's posture was always guarded, her gaze constantly scanning the playground, her body a fortress around the girls. On the 4th day, fate or maybe something else intervened. James had bought a rubber ball from a toy shop earlier that morning, the kind painted with bright swirls of red, blue, and yellow. He hadn't planned what he would do with it. It was just there, sitting in his hands. When it slipped from his fingers and rolled across the path, Emma spotted it instantly. "Look," she shouted to her sisters, her little legs carrying her forward before Sarah could catch her. She scooped the ball into her arms, hugging it against her chest like treasure. And then she noticed him. James froze, his heart hammered so loudly he thought the whole park could hear it. "Is this yours?" Emma asked, holding out the ball with both hands. His eyes shone with curiosity and no fear at all. "Yes," James said, his voice rough with emotion. "Yes, it's mine. Thank you. I'm Emma," she declared proudly. "I'm 4.5. James's lips trembled with the weight of words he couldn't say. "I know who you are. I know you better than you think. You are my daughter." Instead, he managed, "Hello, Emma. I'm James." By then, Sarah had reached them, her hand clamping protectively on Emma's shoulder. Her eyes were daggers: panic, fury, fear all tangled into one. "Emma, we don't talk to strangers." "But Mommy," Emma protested, clutching the ball. "He dropped this, and look, it has our colors." The moment stretched thin, a taut wire straining under invisible weight. James and Sarah locked eyes, in hers. He saw fire and exhaustion, love and a rage she had every right to feel. In his, she must have seen something she hadn't expected. Not arrogance, not control, but desperation. "One game," Sarah said at last, her voice low, almost unwilling. "The girls need to burn off some energy before dinner. James nearly collapsed with relief. The game began, simply rolling the ball back and forth. Emma hurled it with unbridled strength, collapsing into giggles when James exaggerated his misses. Olivia joined next, studying the geometry of his throws. Adjusting her own with startling precision, Abigail lingered at the edge until James gently rolled the ball toward her. She picked it up, holding it against her chest. She didn't throw it back right away. Instead, she studied him with those solemn eyes. "Did you give us the books?" she whispered, her voice barely carrying across the grass. James's throat closed. He nodded. "Yes," he said softly. "I hoped you might like them." Abigail blinked slowly, then whispered, "It's my favorite. I like the part about the key." "The key was my favorite too," James whispered back, his voice breaking. And then Emma's voice shattered the moment. "Daddy makes the best paper airplanes." She called to her sisters, laughing, before turning back to James. "Do you?" Sarah stiffened. The word daddy had slipped out so naturally, though Emma didn't yet understand. James swallowed hard, his gaze locked on Sarah. Her lips pressed into a tight line, but she didn't pull the girls away. Not yet. They played until the sun began to sink, until Sarah finally announced it was time to go. James thought his heart might stop when Abigail stepped close again, clutching the ball in her small hands. "Will you bring it tomorrow?" she asked. His answer came without hesitation. "Yes," he said, "I'll bring the ball." And as Sarah gathered her daughters, her eyes flashing a warning even sharper than before, James understood something with absolute certainty. This was no longer about choice. This was the beginning of a war for redemption, and for the first time in his life, it wasn't about empires or investors. It was about three little girls in raincoats and whether he was worthy to stand in their world. The ball still rested on his desk the next morning, its bright swirls of red, blue, and yellow so out of place among sleek laptops, glossy financial reports, and cold, steel paperweights. James had not slept. He had replayed every moment from the park, the way Emma had laughed without fear, the way Olivia had studied his throws like equations to be solved, the way Abigail had whispered about the book and looked at him, as though she could see every truth he was trying to hide. The storm he carried inside was nothing compared to the one brewing outside in his world of boardrooms and billion-dollar deals. By 8 o'clock, his assistant Matthews was already standing in the office doorway, worry carved into his features. "Sir, the Tokyo team stayed up all night waiting for your feedback on the Singapore acquisition. They've threatened to pull out, and the board is demanding answers for your absences this week." James didn't look up from the ball under his palm. His empire was groaning, the scaffolding of 10 years of relentless ambition threatening to buckle, and yet all he could think about was that small voice asking if he would bring the ball back tomorrow. "Cancel Singapore," he said finally. Matthews blinked. "Cancel, sir. This is a $4.8 billion. I said cancel." James's voice was quiet, but unyielding. "Find someone else. Tell them I'll revisit later. Right now, I have another engagement." Matthews opened his mouth to protest, then saw the fire in James's eyes, the kind of intensity usually reserved for hostile takeovers. And he understood. Whatever this was, it had already eclipsed everything else. That afternoon, James returned to the park. The girls were already there, shrieking with laughter as Sarah stood watchful nearby. Emma spotted him first. He brought the ball," she shouted, her little red raincoat flashing as she ran to him. They played again, and for a while the world shrank to the size of the playground. Olivia asked questions about how far the ball could roll if thrown at different angles, testing theories only she seemed to understand. Emma dared him to chase her, laughing when he pretended to trip. Abigail, more reserved, sat close, watching as though cataloging every detail for safekeeping. It should have been perfect. But Sarah's gaze never softened. She watched with the intensity of a general protecting her camp. And just when James thought he had begun to earn a fragile place in this little circle, reality came crashing back. His phone buzzed in his pocket, insistent. He ignored it. It buzzed again, then again. At last, Emma snatched it up with tiny fingers and squinted at the glowing screen. "Who's Victoria?" she asked innocently, before handing it back. The name struck like a gunshot in the quiet air. Sarah's head snapped up, her eyes narrowing. James fumbled. "It's complicated." "Complicated," Sarah repeated, her voice sharp with disbelief. She gathered the girls close. "So that's why you're here, to play at being a father while planning a wedding with someone else." "Sarah, no." James pleaded, stepping forward. It isn't like that. But the girls had already heard. Olivia tilted her head, frowning. You're getting married? She asked. Her voice too calm for her age. James felt his throat close. He hadn't planned for this. He hadn't even admitted it aloud to himself. He glanced at Sarah, but she was already turning away, guiding the girls toward the exit. Tomorrow, 3 o'clock, she said without looking back. You'll explain yourself then or don't come at all. That night, James sat in his penthouse with the city sprawled before him like a jeweled map. His phone buzzed again. Victoria's name, Victoria's voice, Victoria's expectations, the roses, the seating charts, the articles calling there, wedding the event of the decade. But when he closed his eyes, all he saw were 3 little girls slipping out of his grasp. By dawn, he knew the empire could burn, the wedding could dissolve. He would not let the only chance at redemption vanish into the night. The next day, James showed up at the playground early, the ball in his hand and a truth on his tongue that could destroy everything. The girls would be there soon, so would Sarah, and this time there would be no hiding. For the first time in his life, James Blackwood was about to risk everything, not for profit, not for glory, but for the right to call himself what he had never been allowed to be. Father. The day Sarah finally agreed to let the girls spend the night at James's apartment, the city outside his windows felt different. For years, Manhattan had been his kingdom, a skyline sculpted by ambition, steel, and glass, but now, for the first time, he felt like a boy about to host 3 queens. He had spent weeks preparing, transforming the cold, sterile penthouse into something almost unrecognizable. The walls once hung with abstract million-dollar art now displayed crayon drawings Sarah had let the girls bring home for him. He had cleared out his executive office and filled it with miniature desks painted in red, blue, and yellow. Shelves groaned under the weight of children's books, stuffed animals, and puzzles. And the kitchen table was no longer lined with stock reports, but with paints, brushes, and paper. When the elevator doors opened and Sarah shepherded the girls in, James's heart thumped with a fear he had never known before. This wasn't the nervous tension of an investor pitch, or the pressure of a billion-dollar acquisition. This was something raw, fragile. He stood there in his sweater picked not by his stylist, but by Emma's insistence. When they went shopping together and tried to steady his voice, "Welcome home," he said softly. The triplets charged in. Emma ran straight to the playroom, shrieking with delight at the slide he'd installed. Olivia paused at the doorway, eyes scanning everything with sharp focus, checking the neat rows of supplies as though grading his effort. Abigail slipped her small hand into his, her whisper barely audible. "Did you make this for us?" "Yes," James answered, his throat tight. "All of it, for the first hour." The apartment rang with laughter and movement. Emma begged him to play superheroes. Olivia asked to sort the Lego sets by color. Abigail curled into the reading nook, gazing at the glowing stars he had painted on the ceiling. James had never felt so alive. But when dinner came, the first cracks appeared. He had tried God. He had tried to cook. He had studied Sarah's recipes, even called Eleanor once for advice, though she had barked at him for daring to think pasta was just pasta. But the pancakes he proudly presented that night were thick lumps, uneven and half-dashed burnt. Emma laughed so hard she nearly fell off her chair. "It looks like a squished dinosaur." Abigail tilted her head. "Mine looks like a cloud." But Olivia's little face tightened. She stared at her plate, the corners of her mouth trembling. "Mine is just wrong," she whispered. Then louder, "Everything I do is just organized and boring. Emma is brave, Abigail is dreamy, and I'm nothing." The words stabbed James to the core. For a second he froze, shame washing through him. He had thought his careful praise was fair, that calling Emma brave, Abigail thoughtful, and Olivia organized showed he noticed them. But now he saw what Olivia had heard, that she was less, that she was background. He dropped to one knee beside her chair, his voice low but fierce. "Olivia, look at me." She sniffled, refusing at first. But then her tear-bright eyes lifted to his. "Organization isn't boring," James said. "It's genius. You see things others can't. You make order out of chaos. You're the kind of person who can build cities, solve puzzles, change the world." He pulled his laptop closer, opening the design software he used for product prototypes. Complex shapes and blueprints filled the screen. "This is how I build. It only works if someone sees patterns. Someone like you." Olivia blinked, the tears slowing. She touched the mouse with tentative fingers, moving shapes with precision, slowly. A smile crept onto her lips. Like this, exactly like that, James whispered. You're extraordinary, Olivia. By the time Sarah returned later that night to check in, James was sitting cross-legged on the floor with three very different little girls Emma drawing. Superheroes. Olivia designing towers on his laptop, Abigail curled against his side with a book in her lap. Sarah paused in the doorway, her guarded expression faltering as she took in the sight. The night grew long. James tucked them into the guest room. Three identical beds lined up side by side. Emma demanded a story. Olivia corrected his pronunciation. Halfway through, and Abigail insisted on the stories exactly, no more, no less. By the time they drifted off, James sat there in the dim light, listening to their soft breaths. He realized he had just faced his first real test, and somehow, miraculously, he had passed. But his trial wasn't over. Just days later, Sarah called in panic, Abigail burning with fever, Emma's recital that same night. Olivia's science fair presentation looming. I can't be in three places at once. She said breathlessly, I'll be there, James. Promised without hesitation, abandoning a boardroom where investors were mid-sentence. For the first time in his career, he walked away from billions. He arrived at Sarah's apartment to find Abigail curled on the couch, cheeks flushed, eyes glassy. He pressed a cold cloth to her forehead, whispering, Hey, stargazer, I've got you, all night. He stayed awake, reading from the secret garden, measuring her fever. Humming lullabies he remembered Sarah once singing in a tiny Brooklyn apartment at dawn. Sarah returned, weary and pale from balancing Emma and Olivia's performances. She found James asleep upright, Abigail's tiny frame resting against his chest, his hand still holding the thermometer. The fever had broken, and in that fragile dawn light, Sarah saw what she had doubted for weeks. James Blackwood, billionaire, empire builder, society's golden son, could also be a father. What he didn't yet know was that outside, his empire was unraveling. Singapore gone, investors furious, headlines screaming about a secret family. The man who had never missed a deal was suddenly missing everything except the three little girls, who had already remade him from the inside out. James had always believed that empires collapsed with noise, with the clang of steel, the shouting of men, the sudden crash of numbers turning red. But when his own began to crumble, it did so in silence. Not because the numbers failed, but because he no longer answered the phone. The Singapore deal was the first to fall. It had been in motion for over a year, billions in projected growth. The crown jewel of his global expansion. The investors had waited for him, stayed awake through time zone differences, ready for his signature. Instead, James had been in a dimly lit Brooklyn apartment, pressing the cool cloth to Abigail's burning forehead, whispering a lullaby until her fever broke. By morning, Singapore had walked away. The news hit like a grenade in the corporate world. Stock tickers dipped, analysts speculated, and board members convened emergency calls. But James hadn't been on them. He was at Emma's dance recital, standing in the back with flowers clutched awkwardly in his hand, feeling a lump in his throat as his daughter leapt across the stage in a red costume, fearless as ever. By the time he returned to his penthouse that night, Matthews was waiting, his normally composed face pale with strain. Sir, the board is furious. They called a vote of no confidence. Michael held them back, but barely. They want to know what's happening to you. James loosened his tie, exhaustion dragging at his bones. He had sat through investor interrogations that could break a lesser man, but nothing had ever drained him the way a day of being a father did. And yet, he'd never felt prouder. Tell the board, James said slowly, that if they want a man who puts numbers before family, they'll have to find someone else. Because I'm not that man anymore. Matthew stared at him, stunned. Sir, do you realize what you're saying? I do, James replied. His voice was quiet but iron. And for the first time in my life, it feels right. But corporate losses were only half his storm. The other half wore diamonds, and Fury. Victoria appeared unannounced 3 days later, striding into his penthouse as though she still belonged there. She was as flawless as ever, polished, elegant, every inch the society princess the world adored. But her eyes were shards of ice. You humiliated me, she hissed, tossing the copy of the Times onto his table. The headline screamed, Billionaire CEO's secret family, 3 hidden daughters? Underneath, a blurry photo of James at the playground, his hand on Abigail's small shoulder. James didn't flinch. They're not a secret, he said evenly. Not anymore. Victoria laughed, sharp and brittle. So it's true. You've thrown away everything, our wedding. Your empire for 3 children you didn't even know existed until 5 minutes ago. They're not just children, James snapped, anger flashing through his calm. They're my children. Silence hung between them for a moment. James almost pitied her, the woman he thought was his perfect match, now realizing she had never held his heart at all. Victoria slid the engagement ring from her finger and set it carefully on his desk. You've already chosen, she said softly, though her eyes glistened, and it isn't me. She left without another word. When the door clicked shut, James felt not devastation, but relief. A chapter ended, but the harder test was still to come. It arrived in the form of Eleanor Mitchell. She appeared at Sarah's apartment during one of James's visits, her silver hair pulled tight, her posture regal, her eyes sharp enough to slice through steel. Eleanor had never needed to raise her voice to command a room, and she didn't need to now. James Blackwood, she said coolly, I've watched men like you my whole life. You take, you conquer, you move on. My daughters survive without you. My granddaughters thrive without you. So before I let you into their world, you will prove to me you're not going to vanish when this gets hard. James swallowed hard. I'm not leaving, he said simply. Words, Eleanor cut in. I want actions. She gestured to Sarah, who pulled out a heavy leather photo album and placed it on the kitchen table. If you want to be part of their lives, you start by knowing the life you missed. James opened the album, and his breath caught. The first photo showed 3 impossibly tiny infants in the NICU, each barely to pounce, tubes and wires covering their fragile bodies. Another photo, Sarah, pale and exhausted, cradling them all at once despite the pain etched into her face. The next, Eleanor sleeping in a chair beside incubators, her hand pressed against the glass. They weren't supposed to survive the first night, Eleanor said quietly, though her voice carried the force of a hammer. But they did, because Sarah fought for them, because I fought for them. Where were you, James? His hands trembled as he turned the pages, each one a blade. Birthdays, first steps, first drawings, moments he should have been there for, moments that would never come again. I was building an empire, he whispered, shame burning through him. And I see now it was the wrong one. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. Then show me, James Blackwood, show me you can build the right one. Not with money, not with promises, with presence. Later, as he left that night, Eleanor pressed a recipe card into his hand. Sunday, you cook lasagna for my granddaughters. Do it badly, you'll answer to me. It was the strangest test of his life, kneading dough under Eleanor's hawk-like gaze. Flour on his expensive sweater, Sarah quietly laughing in the corner. And yet, when the girls devoured the meal and declared it better than grandma's, James saw something flicker in Eleanor's eyes. Not approval. Not yet, but the faintest glimmer of possibility. But as the week wore on, the outside world pressed harder. Shareholders revolted. Analysts predicted collapse. Paparazzi stalked him. Headlines speculated about Sarah. The man who had once controlled every storm now stood in the eye of one he could not command. And still, every afternoon, he showed up, with the ball, with the books, with himself. The empire of James Blackwood was burning, but in his ashes, something far greater was beginning to rise. The spring air in Prospect Park carried the perfume of cherry blossoms, but James Blackwood barely noticed. His world, once measured in market shares and stock valuations, had narrowed to the sound of 3 small voices calling him daddy. Yet, as he sat on the weathered bench, waiting for Sarah and the girls to arrive, his phone buzzed like a wasp in his pocket over and over. A storm trying to drag him back into the life he had left behind. The board had reached its breaking point. Singapore was gone. Tokyo was threatening to sever ties. An analyst had downgraded his company for the first time in a decade. Matthews had sent one final message. Emergency vote today. They will remove you unless you appear in person. For any other man, this would have been the end. For James Blackwood, it was a decision. His empire or his daughters. He chose the playground. The triplets arrived in a flurry of colorema in red racing ahead. Olivia in blue with her lunchbox clutched tightly. Abigail in yellow lingering at Sarah's side, watchful as ever. The moment they spotted him, their eyes lit up. Emma barreled into his lap with a squeal. You came. Of course I did, James said, kissing the top of her head. I promised, didn't I? But his relief was short-lived, because Eleanor Mitchell stood behind Sarah, arms folded, her sharp eyes narrowing as she studied him. And today, she wasn't just cautious, she was grim. "James," she said, without preamble, "do you know what the papers are calling you now? A fraud? A man who abandoned his shareholders for a publicity stunt. My daughter's phone rings off the hook with reporters. My granddaughter's preschool has doubled its security. Do you understand the chaos you've brought into their lives?" James set Emma down gently, then stood to face her. "I do," he said, "and I'll take every headline, every ruined deal, every insult. I'll take it all if it means I can be here with them." Eleanor's eyes flashed. "Words, Mr. Blackwood, always words. But when the world finally demands your attention, when the weight is unbearable, will you vanish again, or will you stay?" Before James could answer, Emma tugged at his sleeve. "Daddy, come see me climb," she shouted, already scrambling toward the monkey bars. Olivia called out next. "Daddy, I finished my puzzle." Abigail remained silent, but her gaze stayed locked on him, searching, measuring. James's phone buzzed again. He glanced down. Matthews's name. One final plea. "They're voting now. If you don't come, you're finished." And that was when he made his choice. Slowly, deliberately, James took the phone from his pocket, lifted it high enough for Sarah and Eleanor to see, and hurled it into the trash can. The girls gasped. Sarah's eyes widened and Eleanor froze. "No more distractions," James said. His voice was steady. A man who had burned his last bridge without regret. "I'm theirs now, fully, completely." For a moment, silence hung heavy in the spring air. Then Emma squealed with delight. Running back into his arms, Olivia grinned and launched into an explanation of her puzzle's perfect symmetry. Abigail stepped forward, her small hand curling into his dot. She leaned close, her whisper carrying the weight of the entire year that had passed since the rainy day that changed everything. "Mommy doesn't cry at night anymore," she said. James's chest constricted. He looked up, meeting Sarah's gaze across the playground. Her eyes were wet, but for once, not with sorrow. Behind her, even Eleanor's stern face softened. Just barely, but enough. James knelt, pulling his daughters close. The empire he had once sacrificed everything to build was ashes. But in their laughter, in their arms around his neck, he had found something immeasurably greater. Later, as the sun dipped behind the skyline and families began to leave, Sarah approached him. She held out her hand, not in romance, not yet, but in trust. "We'll figure this out," she said softly. "Together." James took her hand, his other arm around his daughter's, and for the first time in his life, he felt whole. The man who once believed success meant skyscrapers and stock tickers now understood the truth. The greatest empire he would ever build was standing beside him in three little raincoats, red, blue, and yellow. And when Abigail whispered once more, "I'm glad you came back, Daddy," James knew he was exactly where he was meant to be.